I am going to pass the proverbial mic over to Sofia Cartali. You are known as a noted investigative journalist who focuses on human rights. I imagine you also have some really wonderful things to say. Please.
Good afternoon to everyone present. Yes, indeed, I am Sofia Cartali, an investigative journalist. But what you don't know is that for the period of 1 year, I was also actually a member of a non-terrorist organization. That was at least what the Turkish state accused me of. And if I have to explain how did this happen, well, it happened after I got arrested in March 2020. During this was the period when the Turkish government actually trying to manipulate Europe, sending thousands of refugees and immigrants through the Greek border. I was imprisoned. Luckily for me, for a short time, because the Turkish gendarmerie found out actually about my investigations concerning Turkish dissidents who fled to Europe and in Greece, actually. And as expected by almost every non-democratic regime and by tremendous leap of logic, I was accused of being a terrorist. This is the paranoia of the Turkish state, actually. And luckily, I had a very good lawyer, and I spent that year in Greece. Of course, nobody cared except for my family. And I had actually the back of the Association of the European Journalists. And although one would imagine that going to Turkey and having an experience such as mine is something that would be considered almost natural for unfortunately, for every non-democratic regime, it was never expected that assassinations of journalists would ever take place on democratic ground, let alone on EU ground, as the case is for Daphne Caruana Galizia. Yes, I could say that Daphne's assassination in October 2017 actually took us totally by surprise. But what doesn't seem to surprise us anymore is that more assassinations have followed. And it seems that European democratic states just watching this happen. Actually, this is the most uncomfortable and the most actually unacceptable thing for all the journalists. And what we expect, however, is the enforcement of the obligation of every democratic state to safeguard the freedom of press and, needless to say, the lives of journalists. But we are still in 2021, living in a world in which brutal attacks against journalists continue. And there is something we see more and more, pernicious laws introduced by governments that criminalize investigative journalism and digital speech. And I have to add that apart from the pure journalistic side, there is the human side that we don't have to forget. There are people who are left behind, whether family, friends, who have to deal with the loss. And it was this human loss that I tried to explore with Matthew Caruana Galizia, Daphne's son. And let me remind you that he was the witness of the assassination of his mother, something that touched me deeply. And as you will see in the interview, it has affected his life tremendously as well. And I think it's time for us to watch the interview with Matthew. To add just that I took this interview in 2019 in Milan, where Matthew was a guest speaker in the presentation of a book about his mother.
How would I describe my mother? It's one of the most difficult questions to answer, but even though to me, growing up, there were many times where my mother really seemed superhuman. For me, the past 2 years have been like one long day, or like one long nightmare from which I never wake up. It was fundamentally a question of public accountability. I think across my mother's career, she was angered when people weren't held to account for wrongdoing, when they were allowed to get away with it. When people allowed themselves to forget what's happened. And as a result of that, there was never much justice for any of the past crimes in Malta. And obviously, the people who perpetrated these crimes, or people who wanted to engage in criminality, became more and more brazen because they kept testing the limits of what they could get away with. And that's how they became brazen enough to assassinate my mother. When you see what they did on that day, when they turned my mother's car into a ball of fire, you realize how evil and how dangerous these people are. Anger at the Prime Minister and his Chief of Staff. I thought then, and I think to this day, that they are the people who are ultimately responsible. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff has to go to prison and has to spend the rest of his life there. That's what I was thinking on that day, in that moment when I was standing in front of the car. But we also have to make a distinction between the masterminds and the people who influenced and protected the masterminds. By influenced, I mean people who expressed a wish for my mother to be dealt with, and then the masterminds went about executing that wish. This was what makes what we're doing so difficult, that for long periods of time, you feel like you're getting absolutely nowhere. I really feel strongly that we will get there if we're able to keep up what we're doing, and if people continue to help us, or if more people help us, then we will get there. The only way that that's going to happen is outside pressure on Malta to reform itself, to hold people to account, but also Maltese people have to find the courage to push for this internally. There have been some victories along the way, and I think that there have been instances of great harassment and abuse that we've had to endure, and I feel like we're never going to be able to rest until we get full justice for my mother.